I get to go first, and I'm going to pick out one that I feel may be a little controversial, but I feel it's an uncelebrated car that did change this sport forever. And I'm going to pick the Arrows A23, modelled here in its famous orange cellular communications livery.
Hold on, Sam. This is Tech Talk Retro, the cars that changed F1. I love the car.
Nice colours.
It didn't change F1, did it?
It did, and I'll go into why it changed F1, but a big hint to that, Albert, you had a bit of history with this car in a very different paint job, didn't you, in Super Aguri? And when you were at Super Aguri, you were responsible for one of the worst pit stops in history.
Oh, that's me. I did. That was in Canada, 2007. Anthony Davidson was running the car. He was third on that race, and he hit a groundhog at the end of the straight, and he just came into the pit lane without any radio call to the engineer, so we didn't know anything. I heard the engine of the car. I said, what's going on here? That's our car. It's in the pit stop position. I'm the gunman. I have to go whatever is happening. And then we realized that, yes, he had the broken wing. It was full of blood. Groundhog rest in peace now. But yeah, it was a little bit a nightmare. Now it's fun, but then at that moment was difficult for us.
Now, I'm going to pick your brains about that car in a few moments, but the reason I've picked the Arrows A23 is the A23, for me, is a particularly interesting car because it wasn't just the Arrows A23, it was also the Minardi PSO4. And on top of that, it was also the Super Aguri SA05 and the Super Aguri SA06. Right. And this is a Formula One car that redefined what it was to be a constructor in the sport of Formula One. The car was originally designed for the 2002 Formula One season, but the Arrows team, which was really struggling financially at the time, didn't get it ready for the start of the year. In fact, it didn't really appear until much later into the season, and when it did appear, it only did a few races before the team collapsed financially, and everybody pretty much forgot about the Arrows A23. Apart from one man called Paul Stoddart, who at the time was the owner of the Minardi team. He was looking for a new design to move his team forward up the grid, and he realised that the intellectual property and the actual cars from the old Arrows team were fully available. So he acquired them and decided to rebrand them as Minardis, the PSO4, and then decided to go and race them. Except when he tested them, he found that they weren't a great improvement over the Minardi PSO3 that he already had in stock. So he decided just to upgrade that car and not race the Arrows. But the Arrows were all sitting there in Minardi colours, rebadged as Minardis, and Jos Verstappen even did quite a few laps in one of the Arrows as a Minardi before they decided to stick with what they already knew. Had they continued to race the Arrows as a Minardi, they would probably have fitted a new gearbox to the back of the car and the latest specification Cosworth V10. And then they sort of forgot about them and the cars were essentially mothballed once more. However, for the 2006 Formula One season, Aguri Suzuki, the former Formula One driver and Japanese racing team owner, decided to enter Formula One at quite short notice, actually. He'd secured a supply of Honda engines and the team had developed their own gearbox. However, they didn't actually have a car. Aguri Suzuki had, though, acquired the Leafield Technical Facility where the Arrows was originally based and designed. And he found that on the computers was all of the data from the original Arrows design, all of the team's original emails, and even some of the team's personnel had joined Super Aguri as the team was to be known. So he took on the Arrows A23 design, grafted on a Honda engine and their own gearbox, and went racing with it with drivers like Yuji Ide at the wheel. And unfortunately, Ide didn't have the best time in that car. The car was then upgraded very heavily to become the Super Aguri SA06, and they lasted out that season with that car before taking on a modified Honda design for the 2007 season. Now, that's one of the reasons I love this car, because it is a case of muddled identity. Albert, you were instrumental in that team. We've already seen it. You were involved in the Honda variant of the A23. But it was a bit of a cobbled-together mess of a car, wasn't it?
Yeah, the beginning was so difficult for everyone. They were building the team from the scratch, literally. Many of the people that we were involved on the project, we had no experience in Formula One. The car, they pick up parts from everywhere. There were parts missing. Some of the parts were on the limit of the mileage, if not over. So it was a difficult time for everyone. To build a team from scratch is already difficult, but if you're starting with a car that is like a Frankenstein, let's say, because we had to get parts from everywhere, it was even more difficult.
I mean, I think Paul Stoddart, Craig, had bunches of bits of his car in the basement of his aviation facility out in the west of England, nowhere near sort of Motorsport Valley or any of that, and they had to go and do some deals to get bits and bobs to glue on. But Craig, this car actually, from a technical standpoint, is also quite an unusual and quite interesting design, and I know you've been taking a bit of a closer look at it, haven't you?
Yeah, so while I don't think it's the car that changed F1, it was in its time really interesting, and I did lots of drawings back then on pen and paper as it was in those days. But I've redrawn the car now so that we can have a look at what was going on with the nose and what was a big talking point at the time, which was twin keels. So we have the car here. So what we need to have a look at is not just the nose tip, which was quite high, but the height of the nose and the top of the chassis. Everything was raised up as much as possible. So you got the maximum airflow under the raised chassis, under the nose, to go down to the barge boards and the lower leading edge of the floor. And all of the teams were doing this. Obviously, it was kicked off by the Tyrrell 019. Sure, we may talk about that in the future at some point. But this was where teams were starting to find where the compromises were. So when you raise the chassis up and the nose up that high, you have a centre of gravity height implication. But you also have a problem with the suspension. Now, any chief designer in Formula One will always want to talk about how they've designed their front suspension. And it's one of the things that they worry about: swing arm lengths, and they worry about roll centres and camber angles and all these sort of things which appear like black magic to anyone that is deeply interested in suspension design. But basically, to put it in a nutshell, from the wheels, in the old days, teams and the designers used to like the wishbone sloping ever so slightly downwards from the wheels towards the chassis. So the pickups on the chassis were quite low down. And again, that's great for centre of gravity design. But as you start to then lift the chassis up, then you've just got thin air in which to attach your lower wishbone. So you have to find a solution. Now, back then, what teams were doing, what was known as a single keel. So the lower wishbone would actually mount to a little strut coming out the bottom centre of the monocoque, and it would pick up there, and that was great. But as aerodynamics were developing, if you look at the front wing there, you can see the middle of the front wing between those two pylons is actually the biggest section of wing. Now, the rules allowed that section to go even lower to the ground, so it worked in ground effect, just like the tunnels and the current cars do, makes it even more powerful. But the wake from that central section was going straight into the single keel. Sergio Rinland, while at Sauber, had the idea to separate that keel into two side keels, which we call twin keels. Now, in boating terms, which it kind of is, that's incorrect. But F1, well, we use all words wrong anyway in Formula One, so we used to call it the twin keel. And that put the mounting points to one side, allowed the airflow to go out through the middle, huge improvement in aerodynamics. But that gave you a couple of problems. First of all, you had now two separate struts sticking out in the airflow that needed to be strong but light to support the loads. And we can have a closer look at what's going on. If I just take the nose off on this picture. So again, now if you now look in between the two front wheels, you can see where the front of the chassis is very high, and then you have this U-shaped channel. And what was interesting about the Arrows A23 is they didn't just have twin keels, but you can see the bodywork carried almost down to floor level and had a couple of mini diffusers. So it worked both as turning vanes and as a bit of extra front downforce. No one else had done anything quite like this at this point. It was really kind of quite far-reaching, quite interesting to see how far people could go with this. But as you can now see, and if I highlight the suspension in red, you can see why this is such a difficult thing to do. If you look at that top wishbone, that's actually mounting almost on the bottom of the chassis. So that mounting point, which you see in the U shape there, red, to pick up the lower wishbone, really has to go quite far down. Now, what was good about this design, and the reason that you can add this to this discussion and make 3 cars out of 1, and I think you choosing 3 cars for your first choice is greedy, but I'll let you off because it's the first episode, is that section there was a big machined metallic element that was bolted into the chassis. Sometimes they did have a little support running between the legs when you had high loads, but when they were worried about that and they could save weight, they wouldn't fit that. You could unbolt that. So when it came to the SA06, which had a much more conventional upward sloping wishbone setup, they were able to remove that, machine another one with shorter legs, and have almost a zero keel setup, as it was starting to be called at that point, to change the car fundamentally. So if you look at cars today, they don't do that. All the wishbones slope from the wheels upwards to the chassis. If you look at the current cars, it's almost on the very top of the chassis with the top wishbone. So you can see the compromises between the aerodynamicists and the mechanical designers. And there was probably some very interesting conversations about who exactly designed that. Rinland's idea, Coughlan had designed this instance, and then Rinland coincidentally joined the team and further developed this design.